Hey folks, Phase 3 of Wrath Classic is releasing today, and one of the things being added is the new Trial of the Champion dungeon. In this video, I'll teach you everything that you need to know in order to easily clear this new dungeon on both normal and heroic difficulty. It is worth noting though that the dungeon is only available to level 80 characters, and both difficulties are completely identical in terms of mechanics. The heroic version of course has mobs with slightly more health and damage, and it does drop better loot, but all of the abilities are exactly the same on both difficulties. With all of that being said, let's discuss Trial of the Champion. Trial of the Champion is similar to Violet Hold in that the entire dungeon takes place within a single room. In order to begin the first encounter, you'll need to speak to Jaren Sunsworn or Aerolus Brightstar, depending on your faction. This NPC can be found standing in the center of the arena, and for simplicity's sake, I'll be referring to him as the Roleplay NPC for the rest of the video. In order to get the dialogue option to begin the encounter, you'll first need to be riding an Argent jousting mount, which can be found along the edges of the room. You'll also need a jousting lance, which you can grab from one of the racks near the wolves and horses. Once you've spoken to your faction's respective NPC, a really long roleplay section will begin, after which the first trash mobs will become hostile. These jousters come in packs of 3, and you'll need to defeat 3 packs of them to begin the first boss encounter. Now, this trash and the bosses that follow it are fairly unique, as it's the only encounter in World of Warcraft which utilizes the jousting system. If you've already done dailies in the Argent tournament, this section of the dungeon is extremely straightforward. But if you're going into the dungeon completely blind, it may seem a bit confusing. Thankfully, even on heroic difficulty, the jousting section of the encounter is so trivially easy that I actually managed to solo it. As such, I won't even bother doing a deep dive into the jousting system just for this dungeon guide. That being said, as a rule of thumb, use the 4 button to keep your shields up, use 2 and 3 to break enemy shields, and then spam your 1 ability to damage enemies while their shields are down. As a side note, you may notice that the trash and bosses correspond to different races, such as Night Elves or Dwarves, and the encounter will look completely different depending on if you're playing Alliance or Horde. Don't worry though, because this is entirely a visual difference and has absolutely no impact on gameplay. During the jousting phase, all of the enemies will behave exactly the same regardless of race or faction. Once all 3 waves of trash have been defeated, the first boss encounter against the Grand Champions will begin. During the first phase of the fight, you'll need to defeat all 3 bosses with the jousting system, and as previously mentioned, they're all identical, so there's no specific kill priority. While you could honestly just YOLO this part of the fight, if you want to be efficient, I'd recommend focusing down one boss at a time after breaking their shields. You'll also ideally want to defeat each boss towards the center of the arena, as they'll periodically try to stand up and move towards the edges of the room. If they get there, they'll respawn again with half HP, and while this isn't particularly dangerous, it does end up slowing down the encounter. If one of the bosses is getting too close to the sides of the room, you could run over them with your mount to trample them, causing them to be stunned for 15 seconds. This effect goes both ways though, as getting dismounted will allow the enemy champions to trample you. Thankfully, this effect only lasts for a few seconds on players, so you have plenty of time to run to the edges of the arena and grab a new mount before you get overwhelmed. After defeating all 3 bosses in the jousting minigame, they'll run towards the large gate at the side of the room and disappear for a bit before respawning for Phase 2. At this point, you can hop off your jousting mounts and engage the bosses on foot. Just remember to switch back to your main weapon first so you aren't fighting the boss while holding an Argent lance. Now, the second phase of the fight is a bit random, as each champion has a unique set of abilities. Since you'll only be fighting a random selection of 3 champions out of 5, your exact experience with this phase of the encounter will be different each time you run the dungeon. This might be problematic if it wasn't for the fact that this phase of the encounter is also extremely easy. Because of this, I'll skim through most of the boss mechanics and just go over the basic kill priority, as well as a few important abilities that you need to watch out for. For starters, you should always kill the Rogue, which will be a dwarf named Lana Stouthammer or an undead named Deathstalker Viseri, depending on your faction. This boss applies a stacking poison to the tank, which deals pretty heavy damage, so if you have a cleanse, you should remove this ASAP. She'll also drop a poison bottle, which creates a nasty patch in the ground that you need to move out of. This boss is the only one that actually poses a threat to your group, so if it's one of the 3 you're fighting, it should be killed off ASAP before it does too much damage to your tank. Next, I'd recommend focusing the Shaman Healer, which will either be a Draenei named Colossos or a Tauren named Runok Wildmane. This mob will periodically cast Healing Wave, and you should interrupt it every single time it gets cast. If you're unlucky enough to get both the healer and the rogue in the same encounter, make sure you keep the healer interrupted as you focus down the rogue. The remaining 3 bosses are all pretty trivial and can be killed in any order. The warrior, which is a human or an orc, will sometimes bladestorm and occasionally chucks a random player around the room. The hunter, a night elf or a troll, will deal AoE damage to the group, and the mage, a gnome or a blood elf, will fireball the current target. The mage also sometimes polymorphs a random player, but since this only lasts for 2 seconds, it's more annoying than it is dangerous. After defeating the faction champions, you can speak to your faction's roleplay NPC in order to begin the next part of the dungeon. Immediately after doing this, you need to move away from the large wooden door, since it'll open up to reveal 3 packs of trash after a few seconds. If you're standing too close to the door, you may accidentally aggro all of the trash at once, and this will usually lead to a wipe. Once all of the trash has entered the arena and stopped moving, you can pull them 1 pack at a time. The order in which you clear these packs doesn't matter a ton, as long as you end with one of the packs along the edges of the room. The second boss will become hostile immediately after the final trash mob dies, so if you're standing too close to the center of the room after finishing the trash, you may accidentally begin the boss fight before you're ready. As for the trash itself, there are a few important abilities that we need to discuss. Each pack consists of 3 mobs, 1 Argent Priestess, 1 Argent Light Wielder, and 1 Argent Monk. The Argent Priestess should always be your top kill priority, as she has 2 really nasty abilities. Every so often, the priestesses will attempt to mind control a random player, and this should be interrupted ASAP. The mind control makes it really difficult to pull more than 1 pack at a time, since a single missed interrupt can cause the pull to spiral out of control. This is why I recommend doing the packs 1 at a time, just to play it safe. The priestess will also summon a Fountain of Light, which heals nearby enemies. When this appears, your DPS should swap to it and quickly kill it before returning to the priestess. The Light Wielders are second on the kill priority, as they'll periodically cast Blazing Light, which heals a nearby enemy and deals light AoE damage to players. If you have spear interrupts, you should try to stop Blazing Light, but it doesn't do enough healing or damage to really matter. These mobs also do a frontal cleave, so the tank should face them away from the group. Finally, the Argent Monks are pretty basic. All they really do is hit the tank for light damage, and when they reach 1 HP, they'll gain Divine Shield and cast Final Meditation. For 8 seconds, this will slow the attack and movement speed of nearby players, which is why you'll want to kill them last. Once their Divine Shield fades, you can hit the monks and they'll fall over. After clearing all 3 packs of trash, the second boss will activate, but there are 2 possible encounters you may face, Eadric the Pure or Argent Confessor Paletress. You'll only be fighting one of these 2 bosses each time you run the dungeon, so if you need loot off Paletress and you see Eadric the Pure strolling into the arena, you're shit out of luck until the next time you run the dungeon. As for the boss mechanics, I'll discuss Eadric the Pure first, as he's one of the easiest bosses in the entire expansion. His first ability, Vengeance, is a passive effect that causes his attacks to sometimes critically strike the tank, even if they're fully crit capped through defense. That said, my health bar barely moved when I tanked this on a prop paladin, so you can pretty much ignore this mechanic entirely. The only reason I brought it up is because Eadric has a special voice line whenever he lands a critical strike, and I absolutely love it.
How did that feel? Aha!
His next ability, Radiance, is pretty straightforward. When he begins casting this, you should turn your camera and face away from Eadric. If you're still looking at him when the cast finishes, you'll take damage and be disoriented for a few seconds. Finally, Eadric's most iconic ability is
Hammer of the Righteous!
Immediately before casting this, he'll stun the targeted player for 6 seconds with Hammer of Justice. If this stun doesn't get dispelled, the targeted player will take heavy damage. However, dispelling the affected player before Hammer of the Righteous finishes will cause them to catch the hammer, meaning they take no damage. Additionally, catching the hammer causes you to gain an extra action button, allowing you to chuck it back at Eadric for around 15,000 damage. Overall, this fight is a complete joke, and you could probably kill it easily even if you didn't dispel a single stun. Argent Confessor Paletress, on the other hand, is one of the more difficult bosses in Wrath Heroic dungeons. Throughout the fight, she'll spam cast Holy Smite and Holy Fire instead of dealing damage directly to the tank. These spells are really nasty, and while they are technically interruptible, Paletress casts them so frequently that you won't be able to stop every single one. I'd recommend always making sure Holy Fire gets interrupted, and then try to use low cooldown melee kicks on Holy Smite whenever possible. Paletress will also sometimes cast Renew on herself, which heals for a massive amount over 9 seconds. If you have any purges or spell steals, you should use them to get rid of the Renew whenever it's cast. Otherwise, you'll need to make sure that you save at least one interrupt for Renew if Paletress is casting it. The final mechanic of the fight occurs when Paletress reaches 50% health. She'll stun the group for a few seconds and summon a Memory of the Past, which is a large shadowy enemy that can take the form of many different mobs ranging from Illidan to Hogger. The specific memory that she summons is purely for flavor though, as they all share the same abilities. While the memory is alive, Paletress will be immune to damage, and she'll reflect 25% of all damage taken back onto the players. Because of this, you'll want to be careful about using AoE or cleave abilities, as you may end up killing yourself with the reflection damage. As for the memory ad, it has 3 nasty mechanics that you'll need to deal with as you kill it off. Shadow of the Past is a debuff applied to a random player that deals heavy shadow damage and slows attack and casting speed by 90% for 5 seconds. This debuff should be dispelled the moment it goes out. Old Wounds is an unavoidable damage over time effect applied to a random player, and it lasts for 12 seconds. With all of the other damage already going out during this fight, Old Wounds can end up being pretty scary, so healers will need to keep an eye out on affected players and spot heal them whenever necessary. Finally, the memory will cast Waking Nightmare, which is a group-wide fear that cannot be interrupted, and it lasts for 4 seconds. This ability is the hardest part of the fight by far, especially on the Heroic Plus version of the dungeon, though that falls a bit outside the scope of this video, so I'll discuss it a bit more in my guide for the new Titan Rune dungeons. If you have any abilities such as Tremor Totem which negate fear effects, make sure to use them on every cast of Waking Nightmare. Once the Memory of the Past has been defeated, Paletress will lose her shield and continue casting other abilities until you finish off her remaining health and end the encounter. After collecting your loot and speaking with your faction's roleplay NPC, you can start one last bit of roleplay before engaging the final boss of the dungeon, the Black Knight. During his roleplay, the Black Knight will also kill off the roleplay NPC and chuck his dead body into the corner, which is actually relevant for Phase 1 of the boss fight. Immediately after engaging the boss, he'll resurrect the roleplay NPC as a ghoul, and it'll leap towards a random player. Your tank will need to grab the ghoul and drag it into melee, and then everyone should focus it down before it begins casting Ghoul Explode. For the rest of Phase 1, the Black Knight will just cast various generic Death Knight abilities on the tank and random players. He'll also cast Death's Respite, which stuns a random player and knocks them away, but this is more of an annoyance than anything. Upon killing the Black Knight, he'll actually resurrect and begin his second phase. Immediately upon respawning into his skeleton form, the boss will cast Army of the Dead and summon multiple ghouls that your tank will need to pick up. The Black Knight will then target a random ghoul and cause them to begin exploding, so when this happens, you should either swap to the affected mob and kill it off, or run away so you don't get hit by the explosion. The boss will also periodically cast Desecration, which is a large AoE patch that you'll need to move out of. For the rest of the phase, you'll want to cleave the ghouls down and finish them off before you kill the Black Knight for a second time. The fight's not over yet though, as the Black Knight will come back for a third and final time in his ghost form. This is a really straightforward damage burn phase, as the boss has only 2 mechanics. He'll constantly pulse Death's Bite onto the group, which deals ramping Shadow Frost damage, and he'll apply a debuff to a random player, which causes them to take 200% increased magic damage for 10 seconds. There isn't much to say here that isn't blatantly obvious. Just pump damage into the boss before you get overwhelmed, and he'll die for real this time, allowing you to collect your loot. And with that, we've covered everything you need to know in order to clear normal or heroic Trial of the Champion in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. If you want to learn more about the other dungeons present in Wrath Classic, I'd recommend checking out my Dungeon Guide playlist, which you can find linked in the description below. Also, if you're interested in trying the new Heroic Plus difficulty that Blizzard has added to Wrath Classic, I have a separate guide for all of the different dungeon effects, which is also linked in the description. If you found this video helpful, I'd encourage you to toss it a like, as that'll help other people find it as well.